Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, Tarek Entertainment series, the Port Authority, where I weigh some of my favorite arcade games of all time directly against their home console counterparts. And today we have a fun one. We're playing both the original arcade version of Turbo Outrun as well as the FM Towns Marty version of the game. Because there is no perfect version of Outrun that was ported from the arcades to home, I kind of had to pick my favorite version, the one I thought was the best. And I know it's on Amiga and Atari ST, but for my money, the FM Towns version of Turbo Outrun gets the closest to the arcade original, but it definitely doesn't get that close. But it's going to be a fun comparison to talk about just what the hardware did as far as sprite scaling was concerned in the arcades, and why it was basically impossible for any home console to replicate that until many years later when nobody really wanted to play Turbo Outrun. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, got a Patreon link down below as well. But obviously Outrun, Turbo Outrun, Outrunners, and even Outrun 2 are some of the best arcade racing games ever made. When you went to the arcade and you saw something like this, just absolutely destroying it at sprite scaling, giving you an amazing sensation of 3D and speed at the same time, you knew that Sega was doing something that just didn't happen at home, because at this point in time, you basically had the NES as well as the Master System underneath your televisions, depending on which one you picked, and you know full well NES and Master System were never going to be able to make something like Turbo Outrun work at home, so this was just absolutely mind-blowing back then. And as we move over to the FM Towns Marty version of the game, you can definitely see that it is a graphical downgrade. It is not keeping up with the arcade board, but it gets the closest in my opinion. The sensation of speed here and the frame rate is probably the closest you'll get to the arcade original, and it has the same vibe. It actually has some features that I think make it slightly better than the arcade original in some departments. And you guys usually want me to put a little icon in the bottom of the screen to tell you whether you're watching the arcade version or the port, but in the instance of Turbo Outrun on FM Towns Marty, I don't think you're going to confuse it for the arcade original. But the nice thing is it does have all of the courses. It has like 50% of the graphics. It is kind of scaling around some sprites in the best way possible on the FM Towns, and it really does have the same sensation of speed and fun, and that's what you need in something like a port of Turbo Outrun. Some of the computer ports definitely look good, but they really run at a frame rate that makes it feel like you're actually just maybe driving 30 to 40 miles per hour, and that's something that's always driven me a little bit nuts about ports of games like this. If it doesn't have that sensation of speed, it doesn't really feel like you're playing a racing game where you're in the back of a Ferrari. It kind of feels like maybe you're in like a Nissan Altima or something like that. A nice enough car, but nothing that you're going to be racing around in. And as we move over to Pittsburgh again into the snow here, you can definitely tell a difference. The arcade version is going to have more sprites moving around at once, and the tunnels have basically been completely removed from the FM Towns version of the game. But this, again, just looks so incredible even today. Obviously, this is an old game. It was released in 1989, and graphics technology has definitely surpassed it. But when you're actually just playing Turbo Outrun, you do get that sensation of speed, and the sprite scaling was just so impressive back then. Because I can't stress enough, if you didn't go to arcades as a kid in the late 80s, early 90s, maybe you missed this game, but if you compared it to what you were playing at home, you just knew that the arcade was where the best graphics were and the most fun arcade experiences were. And while the Sega Genesis did get a port of the game, definitely not my favorite in any way, shape, or form. And honestly, the fact that I can actually compare it against the FM Towns version of the game just seems like a fun port authority to do, because these are not supposed to be all-encompassing. I'm not putting every single version of Turbo Outrun up on the screen. I mean, there's a version on the ZX Spectrum. There's really no reason to compare that to the arcade original, because clearly it's going to be a much worse experience. Not to knock the Spectrum, just is one of the realities of it. Although I will say there's something about the arcade original Turbo Outrun that always feels like it's slightly too easy to actually crash and spin out or flip your vehicle, because of course it was trying to get quarters in the arcades. So it's just one of those realities. They definitely wanted you to do a little bit worse if they could. And that's one thing that I think the FM Towns Marty version of the game actually improves on. It is a little bit fairer in both the timing as well as whether or not you're going to actually crash that vehicle. And you'll see here as you go through Pittsburgh again, we have that same snowy scape in the landscape, but we don't have that tunnel whatsoever. The tunnels were removed from this game. They were removed from so many ports. This must have been a little bit too much to actually push around, but we have all of the traffic and we have the same courses. But the nice thing is, on the FM Towns version of the game, you get a full Redbook audio soundtrack, which you don't have on the arcade original. So we're going to do a soundtrack sample side by side. First, we're going to do the FM Towns version of the game, then we're going to do the arcade, and you tell me which one you think sounds better. I mean, both soundtracks are absolutely incredible, and of course, one has Redbook audio on the CD on the FM Town side of things, and the arcade is going to be playing samples off the ROM board, but I think both sound incredible, but for me, that Redbook audio just hits a little bit more. Now, as we move into some of the more densely populated areas of buildings here, you're just going to see that the arcade version was never beaten. Yes, there are ports to home consoles in the future that are basically just emulation of the original, and those don't really count for port authority, so you kind of have to look back into the past and think to yourself, what games do we have available and how well did they do it replicating that Turbo Outrun experience? And again, for my money, I think the FM Towns Marty gets the closest, even if it isn't really getting that close, because we move into the same area. Here's a situation which you can see the buildings are smaller and it just doesn't have that same sense of scale and scope. But the one nice thing is at least it is moving at a fast enough frame rate. Every once in a while it will slightly bog down, but you have to remember again, the FM Towns was basically running on a 386 SX processor, which is not the fastest chip around. I remember my first computer after having like an Apple IIe was a 486 DX66, and that again seems very antiquated these days because obviously it is, but the 386 era was even lesser powered, so it's just a situation where you're never going to keep up with the arcade. And as we move back over to the arcade version of the game, all of that color fading is just a little bit smoother. So obviously, as far as quote unquote who won this port authority, the home console version of the game or the arcade original, it is a no-brainer. You should have known within the first 10 seconds. Turbo Outrun in the arcade is the better version of the game, but it's super impressive that a small home computer could get that close, and the FM Towns Marty as the console variant of that computer could deliver something that felt as fun as Turbo Outrun in the arcades. And I would say the developers did an incredible job of taking all the analog controls and putting them onto a D-pad, because it does control very easily and in some instances feels a little bit fairer than the absolute flip and spin out fest that can be Turbo Outrun in the arcades. And there's so many different iconic Sega arcade games out there, and so many of them got home ports, and honestly most of them were definitely inferior in some way, shape, or form, whether it was graphically, performance, and speed wise, or just not the same game that was in the arcades. When you go to the FM Towns version of the game, you get Turbo Outrun, you get the fun. Sure, it's a downgrade, but again, when you get stuff like this next Redbook audio track, which is the next sound sample, you can just absolutely tell that there are some benefits to playing an inferior version. So go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back. I just love the music there, but as we move into this next course, obviously at the beach with all the palm trees and water on your side, this is an area in which you're just going to see the absolute gigantic delta between one version and the other. And I'm not here to blow smoke up your ass and say that the FM Towns Marty version of the game is getting close to something like the arcade original in the graphics and the sprite scaling. What I'm trying to say is, back in the day, we kind of took what ports we were given and we were happy for that. So it's kind of fun to see what piece of hardware gets the closest to the arcade original, and for me it is the FM Towns Marty. And honestly, it's a rare piece of hardware. I figured if I was going to do a port authority on Turbo Outrun, I figured I'd trot out some of the rarer hardware in my collection just to have a little bit of fun with it. But honestly, if you want to play Turbo Outrun today, just download MAME, load up Turbo Outrun, get a wheel and pedal set or a good analog controller, and you will have the full fat experience. But back in the day, if you lived in Japan and you owned an FM Towns or FM Towns Marty, you could play this, and it's definitely a lot better than what we got in the West. But short of that, we're done. Recommend the new port authority down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.